Hello there.
It's Thursday at noon.
I know it is.
Do you remember our arrangement?
Thursdays at noon on CFUV.
Are you ready to get started?
What do you have in mind?
What I want to do now is called first person plural.
You make it sound excessively attractive.
That's what I have in mind.
We started out in radio with an internet show called Coffee Shop.
Internet radio listeners, welcome back to Coffee Shop. This is episode 24 of Coffee Shop. It's the 22nd of May, 2002. My name is Carl Wilkerson. With me is Dr. Patty Thomas.
Basically, we took a tape recorder to a cafe and talked about the world while drinking a frothy beverage.
Oh, one other thing I wanted to ask you about, how about the Pensacola culture, like the everybody passing around the guitar or the open mic closure being cut down?
Yeah, that's kind of the middle culture that this guy was checking out in the article in Vancouver.
Sort of grassroots stuff,
Yeah.
over Word of the Dead.
Yeah, he was saying that,
Earlier today.
that what was going to happen more and more, he thought, was that the people who couldn't afford to go see the big name people in the high culture stuff and weren't interested in the low culture, pop culture stuff, we're going to start doing more and more grassroots kind of things. And he talked about some of the things that were going on in Vancouver.
We found out that we can talk for a long time about a number of topics.
Our topic for today is going to be things that people do at home in the evenings for fun.
That they get television.
Other than television.
That is the anti-television.
Anti-television and listen to the radio. Yeah, that'll solve it.
The New Adventures of the Thin Man with Nick and Nora Charles, the happiest, merriest married couple in radio.
Talking is an important part of the human experience. Some might even suggest it is central.
Yesterday, Dr. Susan Chandler heard from her 16-year-old cousin Nancy that Butch Bixby, the famous pitcher, whose arm Susan had cured, has lost his nerve and is refusing to pitch in the big exhibition game. Nancy finally confessed that this was because Butch believed that Annabelle Waite, daughter of wealthy Joshua Waite, mayor of Valleydale, didn't ever want to see Butch again. Susan discovered that this belief was due to a lie cooked up by Annabelle's mother. Upon discovering the true state of affairs, Susan went immediately to the Waite house to talk to Annabelle. She pointed out that Annabelle was the only person in the world who could cure Butch's inferiority complex. As a result, Annabelle took her courage in both hands and decided to go to Butch and tell him she loved him.
Last week, we read an article in a local Victoria newspaper that examined ways the author, quote, cranked up her lifestyle, close quote, by doing things the wealthy do. In a postmodern conversation, we discussed how experience and talking about experience remained culturally filtered as we examined the symbology of the good life in an episode we call Getting Out of the House.
So I got to take the seaplane last week from Victoria to Vancouver, which was the first time I ever got to fly on a little seaplane. And while I'm sitting there feeling kind of special because I'm going on a business trip.
A business trip.
Yeah, feeling very adult. I basically got to have complimentary newspapers everywhere I went. And I don't read newspapers in print very often. I read them usually online, and I usually don't read local papers. But the Times Colonist had an interesting article that I wanted to talk about today. I want to talk about Catherine Dina's article called A Taste of the Good Life. This, as a sociologist, really piqued my curiosity because she basically goes through a long list of things that you can do that won't cost you a lot of money, but make it look like you have a lot of money.
So you're trying to pass for rich, or you're enjoying the good life without paying for it?
Well, Are you? I mean, that was sort of the feeling I had at the end of it. You hit the question right on the head. And that is this an article that teaches you how you can go around and pass for rich? Or is this an article that teaches you how to enjoy life to the fullest without being rich? It could be read either way.
Okay.
So I just sort of wanted to contemplate that today. I wanted to contemplate what exactly is the good life? How do you know you're living the good life? And in what way does the good life being socially defined sort of take away from living the good life?
2000 plus. Science fiction adventures from the world of tomorrow. The years beyond 2000 AD. 2000 plus presents A Veteran Comes Home.
Flight 123, rocket ship Luna arriving from moon at rocket cradle 4, is fiction.
Mommy, is that it? Is that the one with Daddy on it?
Billy, I told you before Daddy's spaceship arrived here several hours ago. The spaceship from Mars has been here since 11 o'clock.
Then where is he? Why don't I see my daddy?
It's very simple. The more expensive your television is, the more successful you are.
The guy with the biggest toys wins, huh?
The one who dies with the most expensive home entertainment system wins.
Now, see, that's a man's answer.
No, that's an answer of somebody who has observed the world for some time and has concluded that people talk a lot about being social and getting out into the world and doing things and so forth. But what they do 99 times out of 100 when they have a choice in the matter is go home and watch television.
Oh, I see.
So it must reduce to that.
So it isn't the symbol of the TV. It's the fact that you have to have a really good TV because the only thing you're going to do is watch TV.
That's right. It's the complete absence of any other standards that make this one so attractive.
Yeah, but do you go out and brag about your TV then occasionally?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah?
About your home entertainment system.
Oh, that's right.
No,
that's
home
right.
theater is the new one.
Home theater, yes.
Yes, I just paid $400 million for my new home theater.
With its high-definition television.
And it's 4-speaker sound. Be careful not to use the Q word or people will think you're a 70s reject.
What's the Q word?
Quadraphonic.
Oh. That's a guy thing, too.
I was going to say, you poor thing, you don't remember the 70s at all, do you?
No, I just was a woman while I was in the 70s.
Oh?
Quadraphonic is a man's thing.
So it essentially comes down to who can spring for the most expensive home entertainment center.
I see. Do you really think that that's, I mean, is that it? Is that the end of our conversation?
Well, I think it could be more than that. In practice, it rarely is.
Well, I suspect that it is more than that. I suspect that people do group together some and go out and do. I mean, there's a multi-billion-dollar movie industry, and it isn't multi-billion dollars just because people watch it on television.
It's multi-billion dollars because teenagers will do anything to get out of the house, and movies are an obvious excuse. You're 14. You can't drink. You can't smoke. Let's see. You can go to the mall and walk around, or you can go to a movie.
And make out.
And the only reason you have to go to the movies to get out of the house in general is that your old man is home watching the home entertainment system. So you see, it really is the driving factor after all.
Well, what if you want to get out of the house and not watch the home entertainment system, especially considering there's nothing but the war on right now?
Well, let's see. There's, athletics. You still have to get out of the house for those. Well, people still do get out of the house for those for the most part.
Are you talking about participating, not spectating?
Well, both, really.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess people do occasionally in some markets go and spectate still. But my guess is that spectating still happens in front of the home entertainment system more often than not.
It's likely.
So, yeah, but we do have a new baseball team here in Victoria. Wonder if anybody's heard of the Canadian Baseball League yet.
Yeah, the CBL is going to have a team in Victoria.
The CBL.
Yes, the Canadian Baseball League. Commissioner Ferguson Jenkins.
Yeah, and a former Brave is the coach here now. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Who was it? I want to say Jody Davis, but I'm not sure.
That sounds like it might be right. Well, anyway, Shows how up we are on this.
Yeah, my favorite Jody Davis story was one that sprung from his time with the Cubs when he caught a really nasty one-hop foul ball right in the protective cup, and he was writhing in pain, and Harry Carey was saying over the television broadcast, "He's been hit in the eye! He's been hit in the eye!"
That was a good Harry Carey.
Thank you.
So...
Would you like to hear Harry Carey doing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game"?
Not right now, no. So
buy me some peanuts and Applejack. Right. I'll get drunk and fall flat on my back. Okay, you said no, right?
Yeah, I said no.
All right.
Not now, anyway. So is the good life memorizing every baseball story that you can think of or learn?
Well, not anymore. But baseball used to be, how do I put this? It used to be the entertainment industry. That's overstating it. But it was pretty close at the beginning of the century, before the First World War in the United States. There wasn't a lot else going on in the way of entertainment, unless you count theater and possibly orchestral music as well. Think about it. No radio, no TV, no movies to speak of. Not much else going on.
Yeah, no theaters to go to, except in the large cities.
Yeah, you occasionally get the forced culture, the people doing culture so that there will be a culture, and what it usually came down to, I would guess, was much like the scene in The Music Man, where they're doing 1 Grecian urn, 2 Grecian urns. And in those days, I think that baseball caught on simply because it filled a void. The void was not athletics as much as it was entertainment. Much the same reasoning that leads me to conclude that the home entertainment center at its cost now is the center of all social self-definition, of all existential self-evaluation.
So what kind of self are you if that's how you define yourself?
One who watches sports on the home entertainment system.
Yes, but what does that mean about you?
It means you don't have a lot of other options, and before we laugh at that, we need to consider whether it is normative not to have a lot of attractive options beyond that. Are cultural opportunities in our cities or in our rural areas really as great as we wish they were?
Now, this is a Canadian-American difference.
Do you think so?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm in Prince George, right? Population 8,000.
In British Columbia.
In British Columbia.
Yes.
Yeah, right smack dab in the middle of British Columbia, with mountains all around it, logging town all around it. And I went to a play.
A live play, a theater play.
A live theater play I saw on Golden Pond. And the performers were paid actors. They were not, it wasn't down at the barn with, let's go have a show. It was paid actors. It was a troupe that is going from small town to small town, doing a production of on Golden Pond.
Uh-huh.
So some of them weren't even local actors.
But they had a facility that would support that. The town of Prince George had a facility that would support that kind of effort.
That's exactly true. They had a season and everything. You could buy season tickets and see 5 plays a year.
I used the expression earlier, fake culture, I think, or something like that, the kind that is, quote, artificially, close quote, sustained, with the intent being that culture, so-called, should be sustained. That's a fine distinction, I think. Would you say that it's a non-existent one? Whether it's being sustained at a grassroots level or top-down, it's still there, I would think would be the counter-argument. But at the same time, there's something that, you mentioned live theater. I suggest that live theater in the United States has been on life support for years because people don't want it to die because it is, quote, cultural, close quote.
Yeah.
I suggest that no one who lives in New York City ever goes to the theater.
Oh, no, I disagree with that.
Is that
I would disagree with that. From what I can tell, that's something that people who live in New York City do. Now, it's not something that people who live in the poor parts of New York City do.
Mm-hmm.
But it isn't just tourists going to the shows, from what I've been told. I mean, I've actually only been in New York City once in my life, but my understanding is that there are a bunch of people who like to be seen at the theater, and there are a bunch of people who frequently go to the theater.
The Mutual Broadcasting System has the pleasure of presenting the 23rd broadcast of a special series of plays by radio playwright Arch Obler. In this series, we hope to bring you dramas full of the excitement and the meaning of plays, told in relation to the expanding world in which we live. Tonight's play, Rocket from Manhattan, will be introduced by Mr. Ogler.
Prophecy is an easy thing, for rarely is the prophet brought to judgment. Tonight I bring you a false prophecy. The place of our story is a great rocket speeding away from the moon. Yes, away. For the first trip to the moon has finally taken place, and a triumphant airship is now rapidly returning to the Mother Earth. Here, then, is a story about a tomorrow 55 years hence, September 20th in the year of our Lord 2000, on board a rocket ship. A play that is, I sincerely hope, a very false prophecy.
You're listening to First Person Plural on CFUV, Victoria's Public Radio, 101.9 FM, 104.3 cable, and on the internet, cfuv.uvig.ca. Giving sociology an edge!
But you got to understand, there are, 16 million people who live in New York City now?
Some generic 8-digit number.
Yeah. So to be able to sustain the theater in New York City is not as surprising as it might be in Prince George.
Is that generally the case? Do you think urban centers are better for sustaining out-of-the-house culture
than
rural areas?
Yeah, just because they have more people.
Including participatory culture, including town meetings and that sort of thing, where you get the Norman Rockwellian guy standing up just speaking his mind and everybody listens.
Well, that would be a little bit tougher. I think that the arts are sustained in urban areas more than they are in rural areas.
Oh, I'm even starting to wonder about that, but go ahead.
But I don't know about other forms of culture, because smaller cities and towns and even rural areas have centers of culture that do more than one thing. Recall when we were talking to Sean Cafferty last December, the professor who did the history of drinking, the history of taverns?
Sure.
And he was talking about how taverns are kind of historically have been like the town center, and everything kind of occurred there, from courtrooms to picking up girls at night and dancing, even church meetings occasionally, that kind of thing.
Yeah, because the towns weren't big enough to have more than one building. So the same building would serve as a tavern and a church and a courtroom and whatever else the town needed. These were remote areas of Canada in the late 19th century.
Gunsmoke, the story of the violence that moved westward with young America. The story of one man who moved with it. Mark Dillon, United States Marshal.
They all drifted here to Dodge City, one time or another. The Buffalo Killers, the Saddle Bums, the Spoilers. It's the end of the track and the start of the wilderness, the dumping ground of odds and ends and beginnings and leftovers. The place to stop and take the kind of pleasure you need. The place to pass through, and sometimes it's a place to die. My part of it was a sun-baked shack, rent paid by the United States government, and a marshal's badge, furnished free. I was at the window watching the heat plump itself with Kansas dust and roll in towards the town when the door opened.
Your name Dillon? You the United States Marshal?
She was about 50, poke bonnet, gingham dress, beaded Indian moccasins for shoes.
They said there was a steady marshal here in Dodge City. Been living for 6 months running.
They've been lying to you. 4 months.
They say you and your gun can break a man's heart at 50 yards.
What's on your mind?
Want you to saddle up and get down to Gaujai.
Why?
My husband. He owns the White Buffalo there. Roulette, music, drinks. They say the roulette wheel's crooked.
I'll tell you what to do. There's a fella here in Dodge City named Sin Killer Stokes. Saves souls by the bushel. Trumpet playing and everything. You tell Sin Killer about your husband.
In Gaujai, they kill a man who runs a crooked wheel. I don't want my husband dead.
I think that there probably are centers of culture like that in places still. I think that it might be true that, well, I'm thinking churches is what I'm thinking, that there are a lot of rural communities where the church is really the meeting house. And it's a meeting house on a bunch of different levels. It's where the barn dance is. It's where the fundraising for the school band happens. It's where different activities occur, like the Mason meeting, or the church is a meeting place for a bunch of different things, including clubs like Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts or the 4-H club, that kind of thing. It's where the softball team meets. So it is a cultural center because it's the biggest building in town.
I noticed that a lot in the Southeast, that the social activities were church-centered for the most part. Almost everywhere I went, big town, little town, indifferent. They didn't have that many social clubs, quasi-social clubs. There were men's clubs, but they really didn't have the juice that they do in the Northeast. Most of the socializing simply went on at church or through church-sponsored activities. The Standard ceases to be the most expensive home entertainment center and becomes the most expensive church.
Yeah, in some ways. I'm not sure whether it's the most expensive church, but the most functional. The building has to have a gymnasium, and the building has to have a ballpark out back, and the building has to have meeting rooms that'll accommodate different size groups, that kind of thing. So maybe not the most expensive in the terms of like elaborate architecture, but the most functional architecture. I was going to say, though, I haven't been in very much of rural Canada other than just driving through on the Trans 1 highway.
At Winnipeg.
Winnipeg is a city. Winnipeg has 750,000 people in it, so I wouldn't call it rural. Though there is, like, what are those things called? Unincorporated metropolis areas? Some sort of oxymoronic term. So, okay.
I think they're called collections of random idiots.
Oh, I hope nobody from Winnipeg is listening. Just for those who have never been to Winnipeg, there's a great big circle, the bypass highway, that goes around Winnipeg, and everything Winnipeg is inside that circle, and everything rural Manitoba is outside that circle.
And when you're talking rural Manitoba, you are talking rural in a way that few places on earth are rural.
That's true, especially in the wintertime when it's all covered with snow.
On the Arizona prairie, Pascal Tyler says a silent prayer, holds out his hand, and waits for tragedy to let itself be dissuaded from happening. In today's episode of Against the Storm, today we bring you another chapter of Against the Storm, written by Sandra Michael and presented by Procter & Gamble, the makers of Ivory Flakes.
But inside the circle are a couple of small municipalities that are unincorporated, and yet they are part of Winnipeg. So you can actually like be in a 20-story high-rise apartment building, and then 2 blocks over, you'll see cows.
They don't just have packs of cows. I think herds is the term.
Yes,
roaming Manitoba at random and
that's correct.
Making illicit cheese and so forth.
But inside the so-called municipal boundaries are fields where cows graze.
Uh-huh.
And they also have, I think they have fields where they grow crops too. But anyway, it was very odd for me because I'm used to the American model of cities where you have the kind of crummy inner city surrounded by the not so crummy gentrified area, surrounded by the cookie cutter lawn suburbs, and then you get to the rural area. You don't go from high-rise apartments to rural areas so quickly in the United States.
There's an additional layer in Atlanta of which you have not spoken.
Oh, yeah.
The Mall Wall.
Oh, the Mall Wall.
When it started in the middle of Atlanta, it ventured outward and eventually hit the Mall Wall.
Oh, yeah, and it's the outlet mall wall, too. It has to be factory outlet stores in Atlanta. So you go from the high-class malls to the factory outlet malls.
To being mauled by packs of roving cows.
Well, I do know a rural Canada story out of Manitoba.
Please tell it to me.
Yes, but someone along the way told me about seeing an artist way up north, way north of the lake in the summertime. And basically they were there for a week-long retreat in which this artist was kind of helping them explore their creativity and so forth, and just sort of getting away from the world and everything. And then they went to this pizza parlor, and in the basement of this pizza parlor in this town in nowhere, Manitoba, was a museum that had all sorts of interesting artifacts, like really, really old musical instruments, like 200 or 300-year-old pianos and harpsichords and all of this stuff. And this guy just really loved music, and they can't even figure out how the pianos, it's like he built the pizza place on top of it because there was no opening that you could have put these pianos through to get them into that basement. So they had to have built the building on top of it after the items got in there somehow. I mean, it was just really strange to be in the middle of nowhere. And he doesn't sell tickets to it. You have to know somebody to go there and see it. Apparently, these pianos and harpsichords and so forth were rare pieces that collectors would love to have their hands on. So, what do you think of this guy having this thing out in the middle of nowhere? I mean, in terms of what that means for culture, for living the good life. I mean, this collection that he had was a multi-million-dollar collection. I don't know whether he paid that much for it.
And this begs a question that may not be pertinent to your piano friend, but if you keep it to yourself, is it culture? And that's one that will drive you crazy if you try to think about it too much.
Oh, yeah, because he shares it with some people.
What if some guy bought a bunch of paintings and took them home and burned them and said, "Art, that'll show you."
If you should awake some morning, tomorrow morning, let's say, if you should wake to a man-dead world, where virtually all of human life had been dissolved from the face of the earth, leaving behind only buildings, bridges, machines, if you should awake to such a world tomorrow morning, what would you do? Where would you go?
Even more to the point, what if he bought a bunch of paintings, took them home, and didn't burn them, but never showed them to anybody else?
Just kept them for himself.
Yeah. And even more to the point, what if he kept them but didn't even look at them himself? At what point, when the tree falls in the forest, do we just concede that it no longer makes a sound?
So the question on the table is, does a cultural symbol remain a cultural symbol if nobody's paying attention to it?
And I would say that, unlike the tree in the forest example, the answer is clearly yes.
Why?
Here's my argument. Suppose you pick up a book at the library, and it becomes apparent from the due date information in the back that no one has read this book in years. Yet there it is, and there you are reading it.
So, yeah, but isn't the act of reading it making it a cultural thing, not the act of the book?
Yes, but think about the state of the book just before you took it off the shelf. And indeed, the entire time between your taking it off the shelf and the previous time somebody looked at it.
It was a storage unit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's symbolic storage. So I'd say definitely yes.
So back in the rural place where the guy has the artwork off in the barn where nobody looks at it and just sits there. It's just sitting there literally in storage and figuratively in storage, waiting to interact with the next person who comes along.
Yes, the potential is there, inescapably.
It's an interesting question to contemplate, though, because it sort of gets back to the original question that I asked when I was reading this article that we started with, and that is, do these items that she makes this list in this article, and it's a list similar to other lists that I've seen before. I'm not particularly picking on this article because of its uniqueness. I'm more or less picking on it because it's the thing that stimulated my thoughts this time around. But basically, she's making a list of symbologies and suggesting that by doing the things on this list, you will experience what these things symbolize, which is the good life. So are these things symbols of being wealthy, or are they activities that once experienced make you feel good, and it just happens that the wealthy get to experience them more often?
Now, to the many friends who wait for him, we present Just Plain Bill, barber of Hartville, the story of a man who might be living right next door to you, the real-life story of people just like people we all know. Now, Just Plain Bill. Bill's daughter, Nancy, feels her father is still in as great danger as he was on the day his friend Evelyn Groves was drowned in the lake at Huckleberry Hill, the day Bill was struck down by an unknown assailant, who presumably feared Bill had witnessed not an accident, but a murder.
The impression I got from the article was that she was trying to provide glimpses of the, quote, good life, close quote, that didn't set you back as much money as the actual good life would have.
Simulated good life?
No. Glimpses of is not an attempt to simulate the good life as much as it is to give you an idea of what the good life might be. So it doesn't claim to be the thing itself. It claims to be not even a low-budget version of the thing itself. It claims to be a way to get insight into the thing itself.
But why call this the good life?
Well, I think that's just shorthand. I don't think that she's selling materialism here. She seems to treat it with a grain of salt in any case. I think that's just shorthand. I think what the term evokes is that there's having the money and there's knowing what to spend it on.
Ah. Now that leads to a very interesting point, and that is socioeconomic level is not necessarily that thing that identifies class. That class is something a little more complex than just how much money you make.
By class you mean social class.
Social class, yes. So being of a certain class also has to do with what you consume, how you consume it, what you enjoy, what your tastes are, that kind of thing.
Sure, that's why the term conspicuous consumption was coined, to indicate that the presentation of class is important, i.e., and the more substantive factors contributing to class are not uniquely so, therefore. I think the term socioeconomic status was coined to reference the fact that all the money counts for a lot, the different aspects of money, and the things that go with it, the other cultural resources that are related to it, carry weight as well.
Yeah, I think you're right.
The term itself both marks money as being important and...
But it also marks the social as being important.
Yes, it's what the money leads to. A la Bernadette Peters in Steve Martin's movie The Jerk, where she says that it's not losing the money that she minds, it's losing all the stuff. The stuff would include, by my assessment, cultural resources, which tend to accrue to the rich, but are not confined to money matters.
Yeah, this brings up a term that got kicked around a lot in the early 1990s, and that was social capital. I haven't heard a lot of people use it lately because it also came under a lot of scrutiny. But the idea behind it was that wealth not only provided you with property capital, but it also provided you with resources. I like the idea of social capital. I didn't like the way that some people used the idea because they kind of divorced the power relationship of money to obtaining the social capital. So there was this kind of emphasis that education alone could help you gain social capital, or if you just belonged to the right group or had the right friends, that you could gain social capital as well. So it tended to dilute the material aspects of it. But I think that it is a complex relationship, and one that this article kind of brought out in my mind was that having financial resources can lead to cultural resources, but gaining cultural resources can lead to some of the same experiences without the financial capital. But I still think that the question remains, at what point is this a genuine experience, and at what point is it a simulated experience? I keep coming back to Ritzer's work where he's talking about people who go to Las Vegas and would rather go to Las Vegas or experience a safari indoors in controlled atmosphere where they pay for the experience and it's all simulated than they would to go on a trip to Africa, to Kenya. That they rather have the simulated safari than the real safari. I wonder if there isn't a layer of this there, if there isn't this kind of, I want to go out and have the makeover at Sears because this is a more interesting thing to do than to go visit New York City.
Do you mean that it's a status item, or do you mean that these people are guilty of intellectual cowardice?
It is a kind of cowardice, I guess. I don't know whether it's intellectual cowardice, but it's a kind of, I don't really want to experience the world. I just want to get a taste of it.
Sure, I think that's entirely viable. I think that may very well be why such places exist and thrive. Of course it's feasible.
So I want to, this goes back to where we started with the television. It's more fun to watch it on TV than it is to actually do it. And we see symbols on television that suggest that this kind of trip or that kind of experience would be interesting, but we don't want to quite commit to it, so we go out and just get a flavor of it. It's just one little step beyond just sitting and watching it on TV, but not that big of a step.
The March of Time. On 1,000 fronts, the history of the world moves swiftly forward. Tonight, the editors of Time, the weekly news magazine, attempt a new kind of reporting of the news. The reenacting as clearly and dramatically as the medium of radio will permit. Some memorable themes from the news of the week. From the March of Time. 1,000 new details, new facts in the world's history come into being every hour. In India, at midnight, nut-brown Mahatma Gandhi comes out of a conference with the Viceroy Lord Irwin, tells his followers that peace with England is approaching. In Peru, three men, Dictator Luis Sanchez Cerro, Chief Justice Ricardo Elias, and Lieutenant Colonel Gustavo Jimenez, all have been president within the past week. From every corner of the world come news facts about politics and science, people, crime and religion, art and economics. There is one publication which watches, analyzes, and every 7 days reports the march of human history on all its fronts. It is the weekly news magazine, Time.
And that's a shame because there are consequences to ignoring the possibility that there is a world outside of our symbolic representation of it. I don't have a lot of respect for objectivism, but I can't bring myself to throw away the possibility that there is something a priori entirely. I can't throw it away entirely. I feel that I'd be handicapping myself if I did that.
Yeah, well, the real world exists. I mean, I guess there's no way to exactly prove that because everything that exists gets filtered through our language and therefore filtered through our culture. But
there are degrees of filtering.
Yeah.
I would say that internal conversations do take place, but less filtering occurs during those than does when we try to pass on the results of our experience via language to other people. If you watch a jaguar attacking, let's say, a mongoose in Africa,
on the Discovery Channel,
then you've seen a filtered experience. In fact, if you go see the jaguar and mongoose yourself live, it's still filtered because of the social context. But the point is this: you assess it internally. That's less, quote, filtered, close quote, to my perception, than if you try to describe the battle after the fact to someone else. You're still seeing it through the filter of language if you see it internally, but it's less of a filter. Pardon me for speaking imprecisely. Although I've just indicated that that is inevitable.
You're listening to First Person Plural, your source for soothing sounds of sociological sagaciousness.
The police state is using its phallocentric organ, the corporate media, to control ordinary people like you and me.
I think that experience counts for something, and I think that people experience things more than language can describe. And therefore, if you really were in the vicinity of the jaguar and the mongoose and observed this with your eyes, you would also be observing it with your nose, with the smells that were going on. You would also be observing it with your ears. And you might also be observing it with a certain emotional attachment to the whole event that can't be evoked by gazing upon it on a screen. Like, for instance, I doubt very seriously if you watched this on Discovery Channel that you would have any sense of fear while it was going on. You're observing it. It might evoke some sort of icky feelings of watching one creature attack another and eat it, but you wouldn't have this fear that the jaguar was going to turn around and get you next.
This is Escritor. Won't you come with me beyond this world?
Beyond this world, dramatic stories of tomorrow and maybe of today, as told in science fiction. Stories of adventure in time and space, of exciting experiments in science beyond this world.
Where if you were there in the vicinity of the whole event, you would be worried about whether or not the jaguar would catch your scent next.
If you're close enough to see it, yes.
Yes. And that sense of fear would change the experience in ways that you can't know by simply watching it. And that's what I mean by you get to it with all your senses. Now, having said that, I want to suggest that one of the reasons that television is a medium that catches the imagination and the attention of a lot of people as opposed to even radio, but certainly as opposed to print, is that it does, in fact, use more of your senses. That to watch something on so we'll say on a large screen, gets more of your attention, gets more of your senses involved than merely reading. There is a kind of learning experience that's going on that sticks with you longer. And I think this is something that educators and intellectuals have missed. They fuss about attention spans, they fuss about everybody wants to be entertained, and they talk about it like it's a cheapened experience. But in fact, in some ways, television is a richer experience than attending a lecture or reading a book.
Because it's been mediated in a way that is, in some respects, well, good.
Yeah.
Because someone has taken out the parts that don't interest or appeal to you. The idea that the medium is the message can be a good idea.
As well as a negative one, yes.
Because what strikes me about it is that as much as we complain about the 1-second cuts that make up television production today, I feel that they may have tapped into something. I'm not sure that this is a need they have created or a discursive mode which they have created and made us accept as normative. It may simply be that their business is to be interesting. And that is a concern that need not occupy, for instance, university professors, elementary school instructors. They get paid the same no matter what. Not so with television.
Yeah, and there's also kind of snobbery going on here. There's a snobbery that says if it isn't difficult, if it isn't challenging, if the learner isn't there to sort of be punished almost, then they haven't done real learning. That there is this kind of hierarchy that says learning is at one level and entertainment is at another. And I'm uncomfortable with that dichotomy.
Well, that's beginning to be dissolved. People are using the term infotainment more and more seriously now. They use it in contexts much more, allow me to be imprecise again, serious than the original intent of that word embraced, to wit, bad, fluffy, syndicated TV shows about the film industry.
So you think that the term is gaining a good reputation?
I think that it's beginning to be taken seriously by people who realize that it's all text. Fact or fiction, print or audio or video, and so forth.
That's interesting. That's a very interesting thought.
First-hand account, second-hand account. And the overlap is there, and as much as the university professors and elementary school teachers of the world may wish it, they can't construct a universal mediator of discursive etiquette.
Hey, look, mister. Hey, look, you're Mr. Jack Packard, aren't you?
What is this? Girl in overalls, leather
Well, you are, aren't you? You are Mr. Jack Packard, aren't you?
Yeah, that's right.
Hey, well, look, you wouldn't want an innocent man to get hanged by the neck, would you? You wouldn't want that, would you?
Hey, wait a minute.
Hanged for killing somebody you didn't kill at all? You wouldn't want that?
No, I don't think I would.
I knew it. I knew you'd say that. Come on, get on this motorcycle.
Do what?
Climb on a motorcycle behind me. Come on, get on. Okay. I told him you can't pin a murder on Nevada. We'll show him.
A good example of this would be the issue of documentation. There is no statute anywhere that requires me to document one thing I say. The only reason that documentation is respected is that it is convincing. It is a way of tying argumentation to something other than, well, a priori constructs. Not just proof by assertion, but the, quote, logical, close quote, the, quote, purely logical, close quote, constructs that we would make. It's a way of bringing empiricism into the picture. But my documentation may not be your documentation. And there really isn't a way of getting around that and saying, this source is authoritative, this source is reliable, this source is not authoritative, this source is not reliable. And that drives the documentation crowd crazy, because they just can't handle the non-existence of the universal discursive referee. who whistles you off for 5 minutes for citing the National Enquirer in a, quote, serious, close quote, paper.
Yeah, but as a teacher, I was more interested in whether or not they had thought critically about what they had read than I was in whether or not they had successfully documented what they were saying.
The aforementioned university professors and elementary school teachers, of course, roll their eyes at a student who says, it must be true, it was on television. But these self-same people live their lives by the preconception that if they read it in a respectable periodical, most especially an academic journal, then it must be true. That is not valid for the same reason that the student's remark is not valid. You can't tie documentation to anything ultimately. It either persuades or does not persuade, which is not to say that the empirical is not valid. It's to say that the empirical is, or should be, or both, tied to consensus. And by that I mean true consensus, not extortion. I mean the consensus of all our shared experience and all our individual and individualized experiences.
So if something rings true, then it's more valid. You're talking about doing the test by virtue of our own empirical experiences and by virtue of the way that we live our lives. I've often thought that the best studies that I've read are the ones that match up to my personal experience or the experiences of other people. That is, if several people read it and they say, wow, yeah, that makes sense. That's the way it seems to work. That's one test of validity.
I'm not against using documentation. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that quite the opposite. Documentation is the way we tie into the empirical. And that's essential in epistemology.
Right.
I'm saying, though, that when we adopt the empirical, we throw away almost entirely the notion of, quote, knowing, close quote, anything. We admit that there are certain things we can't know but can only guess at from what we perceive. And those perceptions include not just the very obvious five senses things, like being there looking at the jaguar and the mongoose fighting it out.
Right.
And smelling them and hearing them. And seeing that, well, for the sake of this example, seeing it unfiltered through language for all practical purposes.
Because it is a upfront personal experience.
Yes, I'm saying that the empirical extends not only to that, but to our perception of and retention of and interpretation of symbolic forms as well. Text, to put it in one word.
Sure.
In the extended sense of that word. The sense that embraces movies and radio and what we heard on the bus coming to work this morning.
Yeah, I want to bring this back because we're about ready to run out of time here. I want to bring this back to the original question, which was the question about the good life and the symbologies that are involved in the good life. In order to have the building blocks to think about life critically, experiences are important. If we all are sitting in our little boxes called homes, sitting in front of our little box called the television, and having all of our experiences filtered through that medium, instead of going out and seeing things and doing things, we lose something in terms of having an internal measuring stick to judge the things around us. That when you talk about being able to assess things with rigor, you are talking about getting out and experiencing life.
I'm also talking about an approach to epistemology that is more conscious of the way we learn things empirically, not just under laboratory conditions. Bottom line on the article, there's a commonly assumed split between haute culture and middle culture. And what I've just told you should make it obvious that I'm very suspicious that it, quote, exists, close quote, in any objective way. That to sample haute culture like this is not a white trashy thing to do. It's just as valid as experiencing haute culture directly.
And maybe the conclusion that I'd like to draw here then is that the good life is the life experienced.
We will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason if we dig deep in our history and our doctrine and remember that we are not descended from fearful men. Not from men who feared to write, to speak, to associate, and to defend causes that were for the moment unpopular. The actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have caused alarm and dismay amongst our allies abroad and given considerable comfort to our enemies. And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create this situation of fear. He merely exploited it, and rather successfully. Cassius was right. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Good night.
You have been listening to First Person Plural, because how people get along with each other still matters.
First Person Plural is a show created for community radio by Carl Wilkerson and Dr. Patty Thomas to examine social and organizational issues.
Music for First Person Plural is performed, composed, and produced by Carl Wilkerson, except where noted.
For more information about First Person Plural, Dr. Patty Thomas, or Carl Wilkerson, visit our website, www.culturalconstructioncompany.com, or email us at fpp@culturalconstructioncompany.com.
you.